The COBIT 5 Foundation Certificate, Module 3, COBIT 5 Enablers, Lesson 4, Culture, Ethics, and Behavior. Welcome to Module 3, Lesson 4, where you'll learn about culture, ethics, and behavior. In this lesson, the topics include the good practices for creating, encouraging, and maintaining desired behavior, and the relationships of the enabler's goals to organizational and individual ethics. The diagram on the screen shows the enabler model applied to the culture, ethics, and behavior enabler. You can see highlighted the specific good practices that apply to this enabler. As with all enablers, there are both internal and external stakeholders. In this case, the stakeholders have two main perspectives. Some stakeholders define and drive required behavior, and other stakeholders must conform to required standards and norms. This enabler is concerned very much with what we call the soft aspects of governing and managing an enterprise. The culture of an organization refers to the shared mindset of its members that guides their behavior and decision-making. Organizational culture affects the way members interact with each other and with other stakeholders, whether internal or external. Culture is beneficial if it aligns with the values of the enterprise. If it doesn't, then enterprise policies will likely be ignored and processes circumvented. It is often these soft aspects which are most problematic, particularly when the culture and behaviors need to be changed. There are a number of good practices that can help an enterprise create, encourage, and maintain desired behavior. The first is communication. All staff must be informed of the values of the enterprise, how the enterprise expects them to behave, and how they are expected to interact with each other and with external stakeholders. A code of ethics is a common means of stating the values of the enterprise. This communication is not a one-off exercise. It must be repeated and ongoing. Remember also that communication is two-way. Managers should enable and encourage their staff to give honest and thoughtful feedback. We all know that messages can be misunderstood or misconstrued. A constructive dialogue will ensure that the correct message gets through. For a very simple example, think of the problems that can arise from a poorly worded email. Communication should be approached in a formal, systematic way. There is a lot of advice available on this subject. Why not do some internet research and see what communication guidance you can find? A second good practice is promoting awareness of desired behavior by senior managers setting an example. It is not uncommon for managers to ignore policies which are inconvenient for them. It should not come as a surprise if their staff follow their example. Of course, sometimes this happens because the policies are wrong. They do not reflect the real needs and situation of the enterprise. Another good practice is to use incentives and deterrents. Incentives, such as bonus payments, will reward and encourage desired behavior. Deterrents are a means of enforcing positive behavior, possibly by punishing negative behavior. This is particularly relevant to the enforcement of enterprise policies such as those relating to security and regulatory compliance, for example. Policies that aren't enforced are just scraps of paper. The last good practice that we'll consider is the use of formal rules and norms to provide more detailed guidance to members of the enterprise. These are often documented in a code of ethics or code of conduct. This guidance is very closely related to the principles and policies defined for the enterprise. Okay, you've learned about good practices for the culture, ethics, and behavior enabler. Next, we'll examine the goals enabler dimension. The goals for this enabler should take into account organizational ethics, individual ethics, and individual behaviors. Organizational ethics describe the values that inform and permeate all aspects of the enterprise's activities and decision-making. The ethics will reflect the needs of the major stakeholders. Notice the plural, stakeholders. You might think that the ethics of a commercial enterprise are determined entirely by the needs of its shareholders, but that is not the case. It must also absorb the ethics of the country in which it operates. You can probably think of a number of examples of commercial enterprises that have forgotten this and have ultimately paid the price. The goals of the enabler must also relate to individual ethics. These are determined by the personal values of each individual in the enterprise and depending, to an important extent, on external factors such as religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, geography, and personal experiences. The important thing to note here is that these factors are outside of the control of the enterprise, and yet they will impact the way it operates. The final factor that the enabler goals must relate to is individual behaviors. The behavior of the individual members of the enterprise will determine the actual ethics of the enterprise. Individual behavior is driven by the factors described on the last screen, but also by factors unique to the individual, such as personal objectives and ambitions. Let's be a bit more specific now and look at 3 important examples of behaviors that the enterprise must define and influence. First, behavior towards risk-taking. The enterprise must determine its own attitude to risk. How much risk can it accept? What risks is it prepared to take? Remember that risk and opportunity often go hand in hand, and that the failure to take an opportunity can itself be a risk. The enterprise must then ensure that the behavior of its members in identifying, assessing, and responding to risk is in alignment. There have been a number of very well publicized examples of financial enterprises being damaged or even destroyed by the excessive risk-taking of some of their staff. The next important behavior that the enterprise must consider is behavior towards following policy. To what extent will people embrace or comply with policy? Some people will accept and follow policies as a matter of course. It does not occur to them not to. Others may see them as bureaucratic obstacles to getting the job done. Yet others might actively disagree with them. There is usually a wide range of response to enterprise policies. Persuading people of the need for the policies and ensuring conformance can be a significant challenge for an enterprise. In a heavily regulated environment, non-conformance can lead to serious financial and other consequences. The final behavior that the enterprise must consider is behavior towards negative outcomes. By this we mean, how does it respond to failures or mistakes? A constructive response would treat a negative outcome as an opportunity to learn and to improve. After all, the damage has been done and can't be undone, but it should be possible to prevent a recurrence. A blame culture exists in many enterprises, which not only prevents underlying weaknesses and faults from being corrected, but also leads to people being more concerned to protect themselves rather than moving the enterprise forward. We stated earlier that individual ethics and behavior is influenced by external factors. What influence, if any, do you think that the news media in our society have on our response to failure? Okay, you've now learned about the goals of the culture, ethics, and behavior enabler. The final topic in this lesson is the relationship of this enabler to other enablers, and in particular, the 3 listed on the screen. Processes. The biggest challenge when introducing or changing a process is getting people to follow it. The most common response to change is negative. People don't like it, and they will often try to avoid it. If a process is to be successful, then people must modify the behavior in line with its requirements. Organizational structures. Remember that an organizational structure is a decision-making entity. It will not be successful if people fail to act on its decisions. This can happen for a number of reasons: personal agendas, inertia, lack of motivation or incentives, or sheer laziness. Principles and policies. These are a primary means of communicating corporate values and the desired behavior. That completes the lesson on the culture, ethics, and behavior enabler. In this lesson, you've learned about the good practices for creating, encouraging, and maintaining desired behavior, and the relationships of the enabler's goals to organizational and individual ethics. Before we complete this lesson, here's a quick quiz to test what you've learned. At the end of the quiz, you'll receive your result and can try the questions again if you would like to. The next lesson is Module 3, Lesson 5. In that lesson, we'll study the information enabler.